now going to introduce the participants in the next panel, which is called a call to action. Please welcome to the stage Admiral Rob Bauer, who's the former chair of the Military Committee of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, Anders, you know, founder of the Alliance of Democracies, former Prime Minister of Denmark, former Secretary General of NATO, and also Lord David Cameron, a former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Thank you all. So the name of this panel is Call to Action. Anders, you have already made a call to action with your 5-point plan. You referred to it in your speech earlier, but give us a thumbnail, if you would, of what it includes.
Yes, it's a call to action because we need to bring our economies on a war footing. And I would highlight 3 points from this paper. First, we should double government's investment in defense. The current 2% NATO target should be raised to 4% of GDP. I hope that will be decided at the NATO summit in The Hague in June. Second, we need to raise much more private capital for defense investments. That's why in the paper we propose to establish what we call funding vehicles. That is, the European Union or national governments should partially guarantee some investments in defense, risky defense investments. Governments or the EU could take the first part of the loss. We could engage in long-term defense contracts and commitments so that defense companies know that they can engage in longer-term investments. And we could issue EU innovation defense bonds where the EU or governments could cover partially and guarantee partially those bonds. So we call them funding vehicles to attract much more private capital. And then the third element is to change the ESG rules. ESG means environmental, social, governmental standards. And many private investors don't think that it would be in accordance with the ESG rules to invest in defense. So what we propose is to add a D to ESG for defense or democracy for that sake. And it's not philanthropy. One of the most profitable areas of investment right now is defense. And I consider it embarrassing that defense investments are almost considered like investments in pornography or tobacco. Nothing is more valuable than an investment in protecting our societies, our freedom, our peace. And that's why we should change the ESG rules.
You're issuing this call to action because you presume the United States will not be there, correct? Is that the right assumption?
Well, I'm here because I support Anders' vision, and I think it's a very good report because it's not just about spending more money, it's about how you spend the money. You've got to involve the private sector, you've got to reform ESG. I'd also add that it's not just about the money and how you spend it. True deterrence, you've got to demonstrate you are willing to fight. One of the things that struck me as Foreign Secretary visiting KFOR in Kosovo was just how many caveats some European countries have on their forces when they're operating. And we've got to change our mindset. I mean, I think much the most exciting thing that's happened in Europe for the last few years is the German decision to invest more in defense. It's fantastic, but that's got to be accompanied by a change in mindset as well, that when we put our forces into a NATO force, we make sure they're free to do what they need to do. I absolutely think we should not give up on the United States. To me, our history teaches us that we're safer in Europe when the United States is in. And we should do everything we can, including increasing our spending on defense, to convince the Americans to stick with us as allies based on the values that we share. Now, I know this is difficult at the moment, perhaps particularly difficult here in Denmark, but we shouldn't give up. We've got to try and persuade them that it's in their interest to to have a free and safe and democratic Europe and to have success for Ukraine as an independent sovereign country. That's an American win as well as a European win. So don't give up. But be prepared in case they're not as reliable, and that's where all the investment is so important.
Admiral, where do you stand on this issue of the U.S. and where it will be if Europe needs them more?
I think it's very important for all of us to understand that the US, and it's across the US, is sick and tired of the Europeans and Canada not paying enough on defense and expecting the US to do it for us. NATO has been sort of a 112 organization, which is an emergency number you could dial, and then somebody else would come to rescue us. And I think that's wrong. And I think it's right that President Trump, he's not the first president talking about this, but he's the most vocal about it in the last couple of years. But I think it is necessary for us to pay more, to do more, and to stand on our own feet.
He's suggesting 5%. In the report, you suggest 4%. We just heard from Nico Jaspers that half of Europe doesn't want any more military spending. How do we get to either 4 or 5 from where we are now without public support?
Well, the first thing is you can't separate, national economic strength and security from your defense and security. We know all the things in the Draghi report when it comes to the EU, or the steps we need to take in the UK to remove bureaucracy, to get our economies firing, to encourage entrepreneurship, to keep taxes down, to keep government. All those things are vital, because if it's just a question of a stagnant economy and trying to spend more on defense and less on other things, it's going to be incredibly difficult. So I think we can't separate how successful we are as economies from how we fund defense.
Can you improve public support?
I think we can. I think it has risen in general, but it is difficult. It will require leadership. It's not something where politicians will have to look on whether people do this. It is much more on whether it is necessary and how to explain that to the public. I think it is important for all of us to also understand it's not only about the spending, it's not only that there's more money flowing to the ministries of defense. We need to improve on something else as well, and that is the defense industry. That needs to grow, because money is actually less and less the problem. If you try to order something now, a Patriot missile will be delivered in 2035. That is not acceptable. So we need more factories that produce Patriot missiles. We need more factories that produce artillery shells. And that takes time because we need investors. Then we need the right permits in a country, and the discussion on security. If you try to have an ammunition factory, there are safety circles that will probably touch every house in a wide range. So all these things need to be explained why it is necessary.
Defense spending in Europe has been fractured. The efforts have been uneven. Anders, how do you perceive this happening, particularly with the differences between Northern Europe and Southern Europe about how much money to spend on defense? Do you see NATO as being an umbrella for this? If the US isn't there, does NATO work? Do you see the EU? UK's not part of the EU. What's the mechanism that you envision for this 5-point plan?
Well, obviously, I agree. I still consider NATO the cornerstone of European and North Atlantic security, no doubt. But we also have to decide on a more fair burden sharing. So we should strengthen the European pillar within NATO. I have to say that's not the European Union. We need another vehicle. And I think it should be a coalition of the willing, led by France and the UK, the two nuclear powers in Europe, joined by other European countries that are willing and capable of contributing what is needed to first deploy a peacekeeping force to Ukraine, next to be the backbone of this stronger European pillar within NATO. And I hope in that respect that France and the UK will put at the disposal for Europe their nuclear capabilities to create a new nuclear umbrella.
Let me remind the audience I do want to take some questions from all of you. If you go to the app and go to this section, which is called Call to Action, you can put in your questions there.
Can I add one thing here?
Absolutely.
Because I think it is extremely important that we do not forget Turkey. And there's a very sensitive discussion between EU and Turkey all the time. If you look at the defense industry, Turkey has an enormous defense industry that would be extremely helpful in solving a number of these problems. So if we want to work on, let's say, a stronger European part of NATO, then I think we should include Turkey in this as well.
I just want to agree with Anders. I mean, I think the JEF is the Joint Expeditionary Force, which Britain's part of, is quite a good model for European countries cooperating within NATO and actually building something very effective. And I just want to add a point on what the Admiral said about the lead times in procurement. I mean, if we started magically spending 4%, we could easily waste that money if we don't spend it differently. I think what Ukraine shows us, and this is in your report, that the two key things there are both mass and technological edge. So you do need to have more stocks of ammunition and Patriot systems and missiles and the rest of it. But you also need the technological investment so that you've got your drone program, you've got your AI capabilities. And that is where you have to involve the tech sector, the private sector, and venture. If we commission and procure in the same way that we've done for the last 10, 20 years, as the Admiral says, we'll get the weapon systems in a very, very long time to come.
Admiral, how do you divide the money? How much should go towards emerging technology? How much should go towards the basics?
Well, a lot of the basics are missing. We have disinvested in defense for more than 30 years. McKinsey calculated the how do you say that? You mentioned it this morning. The deficit, the peace dividend. And McKinsey has calculated this to be 8.6 trillion US dollars, which is 8,600 billion US dollars, which was spent on other things than on defense. So infrastructure, education, healthcare, etc. So we shouldn't be surprised that defense needs some serious upgrading, not only in quality, but also in quantity. So it is about mass, especially in the land forces. So if people think the next war is only going to be cyber and AI and quantum, well, dream on. That's not the case. If you want to hold territory, you need soldiers on the ground still, whatever the 21st century brings in terms of technology. So it's a combination of mass, and then, as we see in this war, it's First and Second World War tactics and 21st century, like hypersonics, AI, etc. So you need to think about the right balance between very expensive weapon systems like F-35s, aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, on the one hand, in lower numbers, and then higher numbers, cheaper weapon systems to actually kill things like the drones. Because now, in the beginning of the war, we killed drones with a Patriot missile, and that is not good. Or a Patriot missile or a drone killed a very expensive weapon system. So we need to rebalance that. That is part of the discussion in NATO as well, to have that right balance in cheap and a lot, and expensive and very high tech in lower numbers, but very expensive.
In the report, we suggest a division of labor so that governments provide the mass. That's why we need to double at least 4%. And the private investment goes to innovation and high tech, etc. That's why we suggest to raise, to raise the target from 2 to 4% would generate 400 billion euros. We suggest to generate a similar amount of money from the private sector to go into high-tech innovation, etc. We should not forget that within NATO, we're speaking about the 2%, but in fact, 20 or 30% of that should go to high-tech.
Somebody in the audience asked, what about technological sovereignty? Can we rely on American tech, or does Europe have to grow its own?
I think we have to grow our own. I think that's very important. But I would make this point, which is, I think if we ended up with a sort of division of labor of saying the Europeans will do European security and America will do Pacific security. I think that would be a mistake. Threats that start in the Pacific don't end there. And also, I think this point is crucial. Although America at the moment is being rather friendly to its enemies and rather tough on its allies, putting it gently, actually America will need allies more in the future. Because if you think about it, as you look to the competition between America and China, it's not clear that America will have the technological edge. And they've always relied on the technological edge to take them through and win. And so therefore the need for allies will be greater. So that means one of the things we should be thinking of, as well as how we increase spending to defend Europe, we should be thinking about how do we make sure we are a capable ally with the United States. So it would be a mistake to sort of stop doing things interoperably with them, whether that's aircraft carriers or drones or ISTAR or joint strike fighters, making sure we can align effectively with the United States and be their ally long term will be good for European security.
And one of the reasons is there's a lot of capabilities now that only the US has.
Yeah.
So it's a dream to think that we in Europe, if we spend more, have those things tomorrow. It will take a number of years, seriously, because in terms of the production.
I think this is, I mean, Admiral, this is your area, not mine, but it seems to me that the capabilities America brings today for NATO, which is the command and control, the ISTAR, the targeting, all of those capabilities, that could take us, if we wanted to do it without America, because we had to, that might take us 20 years. So we really need to start on some of that stuff now. I mean, I think that's right.
Absolutely, and I think that should be or could be the discussion, but within NATO, not like separating us from the United States. I agree with David. It's a very dangerous thing if we would do that. Can I make one remark on the democracies and the spending and that people don't like to spend more? It's interesting to see that the nations where there is a closer connection to actually the armed forces and the understanding of what defense brings, like in the eastern part of Europe and in the northern part of Europe, where there is more sort of, we have sort of outsourced the armed forces. So we have outsourced defense to the armed forces and don't bother us too much with it. We give you money, but people have to understand, if all of you want more security, you will have to become part of the solution. Also in human terms. We need more soldiers. If soldiers die or get wounded in a war, we need more soldiers. Where do you think they come from? It is from this group as well. And I think that understanding is bigger here in the north and in the east. So actually to have that closer understanding and the willingness, therefore, to spend more on defense is connected to this thinking that you are part of the we instead of only thinking about ourselves.
And I think linked to that is we should be doing more to think how our reserve forces, and territorial forces and other forces, are going to help the skills in our armed forces over the long term. Because if you think about it, people who go to university, then maybe they serve for a few years, they join the reserves, they will go on and have expertise in technology, expertise in communications, expertise in science or medicine. Our armed forces may need that expertise later on in life. So building up your reserve forces, I mean, I think, the models in Finland and elsewhere have got a lot to teach the rest of us.
Another audience question, this interesting in light of some recent moves by the US administration. When you say investment in defense, does that include investments in soft power? And if so, what does that look like?
Yeah, obviously it is investment in soft power, but let me caution against counting it to increase from 2% to 4% or 5%. So when I said an increase from 2 to 4%, it's without creative accounting. It's real stuff. But I agree that investment in soft power is an important element in the overall security.
Yeah, I agree. I think both the US and the UK, to an extent, have made a raid on the soft power, on the aid and development that I built up a lot as Prime Minister, and put that into defence. Now, I understand the pressures are great and you have to make difficult decisions, but I think if you overdo that, it will be self-defeating, because you will see more instability in the world, we'll see less economic development, we'll see more migration, we'll see all sorts of pressures, because we're not actually helping developing countries to develop. Our aid budgets are in our national interest and in our national security interest, as well as having a sort of moral aspect.
Lord Cameron, I can't resist asking you this question from the audience. Shouldn't the UK join the EU again in order to strengthen Europe in defense of democracy?
Well, it's it's maybe good. Maybe Denmark's a good place to make this point, as you've shown moments of skepticism about the great European project. Look, I think Britain will be a good neighbour rather than an unhappy tenant, and I think we've seen that with Ukraine. If you look at Ukraine, which European country, okay, Germany's perhaps put the most money in, but if you look at who's given the most technical assistance, military assistance, weapon assistance, targeting assistance, that has been the United Kingdom. We've done it in alliance with our European and NATO partners. So, I want Britain to be the best friend, the best partner, the best neighbour. And I think actually, when we're looking at scaling up defence, doing more through NATO, that's not a bad position to be in.
Soon we will see a security agreement between the EU and the UK.
We hope so. As long as they don't get too involved in the fish issue, I think it'll be okay.
Let me ask each of you the consequences. If we don't execute this 5-point plan or something like it, what are the consequences going to be? Anders, do you want to start?
I foresee dire consequences. We in Europe have to be able to stand on our own feet. For too long, we've based our prosperity on a combination of cheap energy from Russia, cheap goods from China, cheap security from the US. That model doesn't work any longer. We have to invest more in our own security.
Admiral, consequences?
Maybe surprisingly, but I think a lot of what is happening is about the shift in the tectonic plates of power, and that this is primarily what is happening between the US and China. A lot of things in the world are about that. And therefore, we have to understand that this whole move is not that US is leaving NATO or is leaving Europe. That's not the point, I think. It is about they have to shift their attention to another area, which is also dangerous for Europe, by the way. So if the US, and probably some other European partners as well, will do more in the Indo-Pacific, that is also in the interest of the Europeans. And as a result, we need to do more in Europe in order to allow the US to do that, but inside NATO.
Lord Cameron, final
I think
word.
there are absolutely two futures for us in Europe. There's one where we build up our defences, build up our capabilities, and crucially have a reasonable outcome in Ukraine, where Ukraine wins what I would call its war of independence. It's clear at the end of this that it is an independent sovereign country that can choose its future, choose how many armed forces to have, choose which alliances to make, choose whether to join the EU. That future is a good and secure one. The alternative, I think, will be very uncertain and very worrying. And the frustrating thing is I think we're so close to that first future. We've just got to persuade the American partners that really putting some pressure on Putin can lead to a positive outcome in Ukraine. And we will respond with the defense spending and the investment that we're all talking about this morning. Do that, and I think we've got a bright future.
Lord Cameron, Mr. Rasmussen, Admiral Bauer, thank you all.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.